The year is 1832. A mill town in Lancashire, England. It is 4 in the morning and the streets are still dark. But inside the cotton mill, the machines are already screaming. She is 12 years old. Maybe 13. She does not know exactly, and neither does anyone else. Her name might be Mary, or Ellen, or Sarah. There were thousands of her, so many that their individual names barely survived the century. What survived were the records, the production logs, the injury reports, the payroll ledgers. And tucked between the numbers, if you look closely enough, you start to see her. She works a stretch of looms that runs longer than most people's houses. Her job is to dart underneath the moving machinery, between iron frames and spinning bobbins, to clear the threads that break mid-weave. It is called scavenging. The machine does not stop for her. It never stops. The air is thick with cotton dust that coats the inside of her lungs like snow. Her fingers are fast, trained by months of repetition into something almost mechanical themselves. The overseers call this efficiency. The children call it survival. This is not a story that gets told very often when we talk about the Industrial Revolution. We talk about Watt and his steam engine. We talk about Arkwright and the spinning frame. We talk about iron and coal and the great mechanical awakening of the Western world. And those stories are true. They matter. But they are incomplete. Because the machines did not run on coal alone. They ran on labor. And the largest single source of that labor, in the textile mills that made Britain the workshop of the world, was women and girls. By the 1830s, women made up the majority of the workforce in British cotton mills. In some factories, they were as much as 70% of all workers. In the mill towns of New England, places like Lowell, Massachusetts, the numbers told an even starker story. Young women, many of them farm daughters from rural communities, flooded into the factories in the thousands. They were called mill girls. The newspapers wrote about them as though they were curiosities, as though it was remarkable that women could operate machinery, as though it was somehow surprising that they were intelligent, organized, and ambitious. What the newspapers did not write about, at least not at first, was the cost. The noise inside a working mill was so loud that workers communicated through a kind of lip-reading shorthand. The machines vibrated the floor constantly. The temperature was kept high on purpose, because warm, humid air reduced the number of thread breaks, which increased output. The workers' comfort was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. Accidents were common. A stray sleeve, a loose hair, a moment of exhaustion, and the machine took something from you. A finger. A hand. Sometimes more. And yet they came. They kept coming. Because as brutal as the mills were, for many of these women they represented something that had not existed before. A wage. Their own wage. Money they had earned themselves, that they could spend or save according to their own judgment. For a woman in the early 19th century, that was not a small thing. That was, in a very real sense, a revolution of its own. So before we go any further, I want you to hold two things in your mind at the same time. The mill as a place of genuine exploitation and physical danger. And the mill as a place that, for all its darkness, cracked open a door that had been shut for a very long time. Both of these things are true. Neither cancels the other out. And together, they tell us something important about how progress actually works. It is rarely clean. It is rarely fair. And it almost never looks the way we expect it to from a distance. This is the story of the women who built the Industrial Revolution with their hands. And it starts not with a machine, but with a decision. Lowell, Massachusetts, 1845. A young woman named Harriet Hanson is 11 years old and working in a cotton mill. She is about to do something that no one expects from a child, and very few people expect from a woman. She is about to lead. The mill owners of Lowell had built what they believed was a model system. They recruited young women from farming families across New England with promises of decent wages, supervised boarding houses, and the opportunity for self-improvement. They called it the Lowell system. There were lending libraries. There was a literary magazine, written and edited entirely by the mill workers, called the Lowell Offering. Mill owners pointed to it as proof that their workers were flourishing. What they did not mention was that any article criticizing working conditions was quietly rejected before publication. The workday ran 14 hours in summer, 13 in winter, not out of generosity but because there was less daylight to work by. Wages were cut periodically, without warning or negotiation. When workers complained, they were reminded that they were replaceable. And they were, because there was always another farm daughter stepping off a coach from Vermont or New Hampshire, eyes wide, carpetbag in hand, ready to take the job. But in 1845, something shifted. A group of workers began organizing. They called themselves the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. Their leader was a woman named Sarah Bagley, a weaver who had worked in the mills for years and who had watched the conditions deteriorate season by season. She was sharp, methodical, and entirely unintimidated by the men who owned the buildings she worked in. She submitted petitions to the Massachusetts state legislature demanding a 10-hour workday. She collected thousands of signatures. She testified. She was ignored. And she came back and did it again. This was the texture of the fight. Not one dramatic confrontation, but years of sustained, unglamorous pressure. Letters written by candlelight after 14-hour shifts. Meetings held in borrowed rooms. Arguments made in careful, precise language designed to be impossible to dismiss, and then dismissed anyway. The women of Lowell were navigating a world that did not yet have a language for what they were doing. They were labor organizers before labor organizing had a name. They were activists before the word existed in its modern sense. They were doing politics while being legally excluded from political life. Back in Britain, the picture was different in texture but identical in spirit. The Factory Acts, a series of laws passed through the 1830s and 1840s, were the result of years of campaigning, documentation, and testimony. Reformers went into the mills with notebooks and recorded what they saw. Children interviewed. Women interviewed. Injuries catalogued. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was still not enough to move Parliament quickly. Every reform was fought for inch by inch against the opposition of mill owners who argued, with straight faces, that limiting working hours would destroy the British economy. What strikes you when you sit with this history is how modern it all sounds. The arguments used against labor reform in 1840 are structurally identical to the arguments used against labor reform today. Efficiency, competitiveness, the market, the fear that protecting workers will somehow harm workers. These arguments have been recycled so many times that they have worn smooth, like river stones. And yet they keep working. They kept working then for a while. But here is what also kept working. The women, quietly, persistently, against enormous resistance, they kept organizing. They kept testifying. They kept showing up. And slowly, the laws began to change. There is a detail about the textile mills that tends to get left out of the standard history, and it is this. The machines could not tell the difference between a skilled worker and an unskilled one. Not in any obvious way. The loom did not care who was operating it. And this was, in the eyes of the mill owners, one of its great advantages. If the machine did the complex work, then the human only needed to tend it. And tending a machine required no apprenticeship, no guild membership, no years of accumulated craft knowledge. It required only a body and an attention span and the ability to endure. This logic was used to justify paying women less than men. Women were positioned as temporary workers, girls passing through on their way to marriage, not serious laborers deserving of serious wages. The fact that many of them worked for years, that some supported families, that some never married and depended entirely on their mill income, was inconvenient data that the logic simply ignored. But the machines created something the mill owners had not fully anticipated. Concentration. When you bring thousands of workers together under one roof, on the same schedule, with the same grievances, you create the conditions for collective identity. The same efficiency that made the mill profitable also made its workforce coherent. The women who worked in Lowell or Manchester or Glasgow were not isolated. They ate together, lived together in boarding houses, walked to work together in the dark. They talked. And what they talked about, eventually, was power. The literary output alone is remarkable. The Lowell Offering is the most famous example, but there were others. Women writing poetry on scraps of paper during meal breaks. Women writing letters home that described, with extraordinary precision, the physical reality of mill work. Women writing fiction that imagined different lives, different systems, different possibilities. This was not what the mill owners had in mind when they offered access to lending libraries as a recruitment tool. But it was what happened. There is also the question of what came after. Historians sometimes frame the Industrial Revolution as a story of rupture, the old world broken apart by the new. And there is truth in that. But for the women who worked in the mills, the story is also one of continuity. The networks they built, the organizational habits they developed, the sense of collective grievance and collective agency, these did not disappear when the mills eventually mechanized further and shed workers. They fed into the labor movement. They fed into the suffrage movement. The women who had spent years arguing for the right to control the conditions of their own labor were primed, in a very particular way, for the argument that they should control something else as well. We tend to tell these histories separately. Labor history in one book. Women's history in another. Industrial history in a third. But they are not separate. They are the same story, told from different angles. The mill girl who darted under the loom at 4 a.m. and the woman who stood before a legislative committee a decade later demanding a 10-hour day and the suffragist who marched in 1913, these are not three different characters. They are, in many cases, the same woman or her daughter, or the woman who lived in the next room of the boarding house and told her what was possible. The Industrial Revolution did not happen to women. Women were not passive receivers of a change that men made. They were inside it, holding it up, making it run and slowly, at great cost, bending it toward something more bearable. That is not a footnote to the story of the industrial age. That is the story.